Today, I have the pleasure of talking to Alun Davies, Operations Director at ElectrAssure. Hi, Alan. How are you?
Hi, John. Yeah, I'm very well. You?
You're absolutely buzzing for today because there's so much going on in the EV industry, isn't there?
Yes. Yeah, there is. Yeah.
It's brilliant. And one of the things that's happened is recently the government have published a draft public charge point regulation, which doesn't get a lot of people excited. But we, as EV nerds, love this stuff because it's going to start to iron out some of the issues that there are that drivers have with the public charging network. What do the regulations mean for drivers?
I mean, as with any sort of like they had the smart charging regulations that came out last year, which was aimed at trying to improve the provision of a charger in the first place to make sure that they were all able to carry out certain functions and provide certain amounts of information. And I suppose this is kind of similar, although it's addressing a point that's been knocking around since we were involved, really, which is the age-old sort of problem that EV drivers had of having 1,000 RFID cards back way when, and then 100 million apps and God knows what else. And one of the things that certain providers adopted, but not everybody, was the ability to use contactless payment, which everybody uses everywhere in Apple Pay, contactless, etc. Google Pays, they're all easily accessible, and most of the population use them. So that really is the kind of the primary ease of use piece I took from it anyway, is the ability to be able to rock up, plug in and use your card to start a charge. That will make life a much easier experience for people using public chargers. The fact that they have to report properly as to what availability they have, what status the unit is in, whether it's available, unavailable, blocked, etc. That will make life a lot easier for people who are trying to assess whether a charging location is suitable for them, whether it's actually in use, whether they can get a suitable charge for that. And I suppose the other one really is that they have stipulated that there is a 24-hour helpline, so that the people are able to speak to somebody if there's a problem at any time, because it stipulates it has to be a 24-hour 365 provision. So ultimately, there was a need to improve the public charging provision. It has been improving, but in the sense that new installations have been popping up that are better, but you still have legacy chargers out there that are street ornaments, if I'm being rude, which I am, but they are. There are units out there that don't work, haven't worked, and aren't particularly useful to anybody. But by bringing those regulations out and enforcing a sort of level playing field for all public charging provisions, you will find that people who rely on public chargers, whether it be infrequently or frequently, they'll find it an easier experience. So I can understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I use public chargers quite a lot because I do ridiculous miles in my EV. Yeah. But the government has said that right from the get-go, right from when they started back in 2010, heading out charging infrastructure, that the majority of charging will happen at home, and it'll be off street and people will plug in their EV, happy days. But 40% of people don't have off street parking, and it's a pain. So if you haven't got your own driveway or a way of getting your vehicle off the road, it's a really difficult challenge to get a charge and not rely on the public infrastructure. And as you say, some of that ain't working particularly well. So what do government and industry need to do, and how can fleet drivers kind of overcome this challenge?
There's a sort of couple of angles to this, really, and it's depends on which sort of way you go at it. The sort of immediate one, the one that's quite well publicised and is being done sort of from a private provision into the public space, is the likes of the GridServe super hubs. you know, I'm talking locally, like we're in Letchworth in Hertfordshire, and just down the road in Stevenage, one of the hotels went bust. It's just on the A1, but it's in an amazing location. It's on the A1M into London. They had quite a significant amount of grounds. So from what I understand, GridServe have bought the land and they're going to build another super hub there. That's ideal. That sort of provision will mean that if someone is driving into North London or even on the way down south from further up north, they've got a stop point where they could receive a reliable, faster charge as part of their, their sort of charging routine, or whether it be a sort of stopgap to get them to where they're going. But in that sense, I was having conversations with Hertfordshire Council actually a little while back, and they were talking about their plans, and they had a sort of draft plan for going forwards. And they were also talking about how they provided charging properly to like the public, to residents, etc. And we discussed in a very similar fashion to what we were just saying. Actually, we discussed the fact that throwing slow on-street charging into residential areas will just create a bum fight. You'll end up with people who don't drive EVs who resent it, and people who do drive EVs who can't access it because there are internal combustion engine vehicles parked in front of it. So if people don't have driveways but they do have on-street parking, but it isn't necessarily theirs, putting a charger in front of their house doesn't always fix the problem. My point to the council was that they, if they, in a similar fashion to what GridServe have proved works in the sort of private to public space, if they provided that from a sort of council, so a governmental point of view to the public, then you're adding to that. And so where the council owns huge amounts of land in terms of parks and publicly available car parks, etc., if they were to put rapid charging into those areas as hubs, you make EV charging more possible for people who can't park on their driveways. And that was, I suppose, that was my kind of point to them in terms of their draft, because they had a lot in there on, well, we'll throw, I forget how many it was, but X amount, 100 public chargers out into the street parking. And I said, well, redirect your funds to hub charging. That's what EV drivers know and use. Apart from, and I will admit, I come from a place where I do have a charger on my driveway, so I don't have this problem. But where I do use charging to get me from A to B, or even from B to A when I'm coming back home, you don't want to be. It's not very often, apart from maybe at the office, where I plug in for a significant period of time. I'm not on site for very long, so hub charging is much more usable, much more friendly to your average EV driver than it is to have the dozens and dozens of slow chargers on a street where, unless you live there, and as I just explained, it might be quite problematic to do, they're actually not that usable. So, yeah, as I say, in both the private and public space, hub rapid charging, I think, has to be the way forward.
But presumably you've also got that wonderful place where you come in as ElectrAssure in providing workplace and depot charging. So for those who don't have off-street parking, they could potentially be using the workplace charging and depot charging facilities rather than rocking into a hub. If you're there for 6 hours, you can take a slower charge, 22 kilowatts, happy days.
Yeah. So like we've got chargers at our office here. We have an entirely electric office fleet. So our vans, obviously, because of the miles they do, because of the national contracts we're operating on, haven't unfortunately been able to transition to EV yet because of their payloads, etc. But in terms of our company vehicles, so our pedestrian passenger vehicles, if you want to call them that, they're all EV. So, but of the 6 of us that are in here, 2 of us have home charging. The others are quite comfortable relying on those hubs that I mentioned previously, if they're going long distances, or actually just plugging in when they come into work. And realistically, they probably need to plug in once or twice a week. And it's quite a simple arrangement. We kind of we book it in amongst ourselves. It's just verbal, really. There's no need for a booking procedure. But on a larger scale, for sure, if you've got charging at your local depot or your workplace, National Grid operate a similar sort of like operation where they prioritize their white fleet, their commercial vehicles, but they also allow company cars to plug in, and on a pay-as-you-go basis, they're allowed to use those chargers as well, and it works. So, yeah, if you have workplace charging and the hub charging is around to help you out in a longer journey, or if you need a top up or a stopgap, then I think we're getting close then to a provision that could work for not everybody, but a lot more people than what has been before.
One of the things that people cite as a reason for not going to electric is they say, oh, there's nobody who's going to be able to service my vehicle. They're not going to be able to maintain it because nobody really understands how electric vehicles work. Yeah. And that was true some time ago, but more and more dealerships and organizations are having skilled technicians to work in this space. But we recognize that there is a skills gap, and that we don't have sufficient technicians who can work on vehicles. And ElectrAssure have done something about this, haven't you? You're closing the skills gap with a local college.
Yeah, we're trying to. So we had a meeting a long time ago, maybe a year ago, with North Herts College, which again, as I mentioned previously, is just down the road from us in Hertfordshire, it's in Stevenage. And initially the conversation was around, because we have apprentices, right? We have apprentices that we bring in and we mold into electric vehicle installation gods, or whatever they want to be called. But no, very, very good engineers, and we train them to a very high standard. And originally the conversation was around how, I don't want to go into too much detail about this because it's quite complicated, but essentially, you can do like a full-time course that isn't an apprenticeship. But that leaves you with a bit of a gap because you're trained by a college, but you're not trained on site. So it makes you quite difficult to position in terms of an employer. Now, we've found a way of doing that. So they were talking to me about how we were doing it and why we were able to employ people who've been through the full-time provision as opposed to bringing in apprentices straight off the gate. And I said that it was added value. It was the fact that we were able to immediately add value to that individual rather than just trying to treat them as, a name and number and a qualification. And she asked what that was. And I said that we had in-house training facilities that we, get the guys onto. We take chargers apart on our boardroom desk and we go through things and we do all the back office stuff and whatever else. And she said, well, is there any way that we could do that sort of thing here? That started the conversation. So essentially, not far off 12 months later, I would imagine, it does still, I can't help but grin when I say it. So the ElectrAssure Training Academy is now in the final stages. It's ready for the new learners coming in September. So essentially, it's a series of training rigs. We've provided some charge points and some electrical switch gear that will power them. They're connected onto temporary power supplies. They're all smart chargers, so they're connected to a back office that the lecturers will have access to, so they can show them how that all works, how you can send commands and take in usage, etc. But we've also put some chargers in for the EVs that they have in, because they've now realised that rather than just bringing in some fairly ancient internal combustion engine vehicles and getting the guys to I'm not very good at cars, so take the exhaust and put it back on again, or fix this or that or the other. They've now got some EVs in there, so they can start to train the mechanics as well on how to approach an electric vehicle when it comes into a garage. So ultimately, the provision that is there for full-time apprentice and external learners to be trained in the electric vehicle charging itself, but also for the mechanics students on site to have access to electric vehicles and the sort of repair and maintenance of those, and also how to charge them. So we're pretty excited about it. And as I say, that's due to kind of go live in September, ready for the new intake.
That's fantastic. You're giving something back, and you should be really applauded for that. Well done.
no, it's yeah, it's pretty cool. We're quite excited about it.
Now, you said you didn't know much about cars, but one thing you do know an awful lot about is electricity. And all electricity is not equal, is it? Because some of it's made from rotten old fossil fuels, and some of it is renewable. How important is it that we use renewable energy in electric vehicles?
I was having a conversation with somebody about this a little while ago, and there is what's called the holy grail, isn't there, when it comes to charging? If you have solar panels on site, or a renewable energy source on site, and you're able to store that energy in a battery and then dispense it for charging when somebody turns up to wish to charge, that's your holy grail. You've got almost near as close as you can possibly get a zero carbon footprint for that electric charge, and that becomes, as I say, that's manna from heaven. That's the sort of stuff that, not just from a sort of PR point of view, and not just from a reduction of emissions, and as you said earlier, removing fossil fuels from the supply chain, that becomes huge. So where that is possible, it's ideal. Obviously, it's something that that always, where it's possible, it should be investigated. We've got a couple of projects on at the minute where they're looking at large scale charging provision, and we're exploring the possibility of having the battery storage and using the existing solar panels they've got on site. Again, if we can make all that hook up and line up together, that becomes a real positive, both in terms of, as I say, being able to charge their vehicles properly, but in a completely renewable fashion. And that's the ultimate goal, I think, really, for any sort of charge. If you can start to roll that out, that becomes a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, it's game changer, isn't it? The recently you were talking there about electric vehicles and charging and how important it is. And the Association of Fleet Professionals have just been talking recently about charging has become the single thing which occupies fleet managers' minds far more than maintenance does. And it used to be maintenance. That was the thing you focused on, keeping your vehicles roadworthy. Now it's, how do I charge? Where do I charge? Where's the charging infrastructure? How do I pay my drivers for charging when they're out and about? How do we get home charging? How would you start to address some of these issues and help them overcome those challenges?
I think you kind of alluded to it earlier, when you very gently and very helpfully redirected me from my my line of answer, when I said that, when I was talking about public hubs, and you said, well, what about depot charging? What I got from that article, and the biggest problem with all of that, is that the majority of the issues that they're talking about seems to stem from where businesses are operating electric fleets and relying on public charging. And that kind of comes full circle back around to the original question you asked me right at the very beginning of this, is why doesn't it work necessarily? And as I said, it's because some of the public charging is very good. It's very well set up. It's very well managed. And some of it is frankly archaic and a bit legacy, and it doesn't work very well. And it's how you're able to kind of utilize that properly if you don't have your own chargers. Now, if you have your own chargers, yes, I understand there are problems with it. But if we stick with the kind of public provision for now, the biggest problem that we know of in terms of where we have a commercial fleet that are trying to use chargers, and they tell us that they're planning to use public chargers as well, is the size of the vans. If you're operating a long wheelbase vehicle, commercial vehicle, they do not fit in a charging bay. And particularly if the plug-in is next to the driver's door, as it very often is, you're parked across 3 bays, and then you become very unpopular. You can get parked across 3 bays, particularly if they're busy chargers. So, where businesses are running electric fleets and primarily using public charging, to me, that's hugely problematic and should be avoided where possible. I understand it's not possible in some cases, but that sort of if I was thinking about it from sort of our business point of view, if all our vans were electric and we were relying on public charging to get them to their sites, I think the headaches would be astronomical. I do understand that there are problems that come from installing your own chargers, workplace chargers, depot chargers. I do understand that they can be problematic in terms of who pays for what and managing who's authorized to use which chargers and when. But ultimately, that's about engaging with the right people early. Making sure that the assessment of your driver behaviours and your vehicle mileages is right, and then building that from there. So understanding what your drivers are doing, what your vehicles are doing, and then understanding what charges you need to support those drivers, and then ultimately making sure that when you install those units, they're managed properly. There's software that helps you to itemize billing and put it all together in a sense that is understandable for your managers, your users, and anybody else looking in, really. Because if you miss out any of those key milestones, you will end up with problems later on.
And that's the key thing, isn't it? When people start this transition, there's a temptation just to say, oh, let's get the shiny boxes. Let's get Teslas. Let's get ID this, ID that. Let's go and get the electric vehicles. Mm-hmm. And charging is very much a secondary thought. Oh, yeah, we're going to need to charge them.
Yeah.
And the ElectrAssure way is to be engaged as early as possible in the transition so that you can plan what energy is available, how you hook up to it, what kit you have on site, how you load manage it, so that you get the best charging experience when the cars do come.
Yeah, that's correct. So when it's worked at its best for us is when we either have sight of the vehicles that are on order, i.e. they're not here yet. We've ordered these. We're going to need to charge them in this sort of fashion. They will have this dwell time. They will have this turnaround. Their mileage pattern is this. They're likely to come back with this amount of charge on tap. We'll need them to go back out again in a certain period. And we can assess it then and say, okay, well, on that basis, it may be that they all go out at 6 a.m. and they're all back by 2 and they've done 60 miles and we can plug them in until 8 a.m. the next day. Fine. You can have banks and banks of AC fast chargers that will charge those vehicles within that dwell time, and they'll be set up to go out the next day. That's not a problem. You may also have fleets where they come back for a very short period of time and they have to go immediately back out. They may not need a huge amount of charge, but it's way above what you'd get out of a standard AC charger. If we have visibility of that, it's not simply a case of a customer coming to us and saying, we need 4 chargers, please. Okay, what does that look like? We don't know. Good. If you don't know, we don't know. So, and as I say, I know that there are pressures on businesses, particularly from sort of like governmental organisations like TfL and the sort of the boards that look after generation, water, service, etc., where they're saying if we engage with providers, they must drive EV. They must run a zero emission fuel. You find that in London. You find it, as I say, TfL. They seem to be stipulating it a lot more. And if that hasn't been planned for, and you're successful in winning the contract or you're renewed in the contract, it's now part of your terms. If you haven't allowed for a significant, a suitable period of consultation to work out what it is you need and where, you'll get caught out. And that, I think, part of the problem with that AFP document talks about is, it's a huge problem, but so is everything else if you don't plan for it properly.
Precisely. And that's a really great place to leave this, because Alun Davies is one of those people who clearly has demonstrated throughout this interview that he really knows his onions. And what we all need when we're planning this transition is somebody, a trusted friend, who can come along and advise. And ElectrAssure give you that experience of how many years now, Alan, you've been doing this?
Nearly 11 now.
That's as long as the industry has existed in the UK. He brings that to the table and can help guide you through the process of moving from wherever you are in your EV transition, right through to delivery of efficient fleet operations that are clean and electric. Yeah. Alan, you're a superstar, mate.
No, that's a rumor, but thank you very much all the
same. It's been a joy. Thanks ever so much, Alan. And yeah, look out for the next GreenFleet Talks, because we'll be chatting to other brilliant industry people who know their onions.